Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Egypt Otis. I go by pronouns she, her, hers. I'm an owner of Comma Bookstore and Social Hub, where we specialize in books regarding people of color. We have locally curated products and local art as well. And I am also an Afro Latina woman, very proud of my culture, very proud of my heritage. I've done a lot of work in advocacy and working through a lens of racial justice and taken a trauma-informed approach to any work that I've ever done in relation to advocacy and policy adjacent work. So I'm really honored to be sitting in this panel here, well, sitting via Zoom, moderating this panel. This is a very important discussion I think is definitely needed right now. So I really want to start off by first commenting about COVID-19 and how I believe that a lot of the healthcare inequities that we knew existed in communities of color, it has really amplified it. And I think that it's an important discussion that we need to have, as well as just the need of representation in this work in healthcare, mental health care professions. So I really want to start off the conversation first with the introductions of the panelists today. So I'm going to give you all time to introduce yourselves, what your name is, your pronouns, as well as what organization that you are representing, and what your job title is. So let's start. Anybody can go.
I can go ahead and go first. So I'm Alex Brace, he, him, his are pronouns I use. I am the executive director at the Small Talk Children's Advocacy Center in Lansing. So we work with kids who have been sexually and physically abused in Em and Eaton counties. I've been a member of Small Talk since 2011. I started as a therapist. The executive director now. I still see a small caseload of people because I can't quite get rid of that piece of me that still loves doing therapy for kids and children. So I went to MSU and got my bachelor's in psychology, and then got a graduate degree in counseling from MSU as well. And I've been working in mental health, my entire adult life pretty much. So just honored to, again, a Small Talk to be, sponsoring this and starting this panel and this discussion, and to be here with all of you today about this, really important topic. So thanks.
Okay, I'll go. My name is Nedra Cannon. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. So I wear a couple of hats. I am the clinical director of a private practice in the East Lansing area, called Nedra Cannon and Associates. Our staff is full of clinicians and life coaches, all of color, serving the area, as well as we are able to do life coaching across the United States. And we really have a focus in trauma-related work, as well as working with children, all the way up to adults. And I also have a nonprofit that I started last year called Healers of Color Collaborative of Michigan. And with that nonprofit, our focus is really on trying to raise scholarship funds for folks of color, queer folks of color, to receive mental health related services in relation to the disparities, right, and access to care, as well as healers of color. So anyone that would identify as a healer, whether it's a clinician, trauma-informed yogi, a Reiki nurse practitioner, whatever you might be, but to be able to increase their expertise. So finances to increase their expertise. And we've also established a provider database as well, so throughout Michigan, so that we amongst ourselves can really start to make sure that we are referring to each other, for each other, and by each other, and providing some training resources and things. And also a field liaison for Michigan State School of Social Work program. So few hats, and very proud to be here. Alex and I have crossed paths many, many moons ago, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. Thank you.
Okay, I guess that leaves me. So my name is Sue Wynn. I use she, her pronouns. I recently graduated from Michigan State University with a bachelor's in social work, and I'm currently pursuing my master's in social work. So I'm still a student, still going into my education. In terms of the hats I wear, I was a former intern at Small Talk Children's Advocacy Center, so super excited to be here today with you all and to talk about this important topic. I'm also part of the Union of Vietnamese Student Associations in the Midwest, where I'm part of the Civic Engagement Committee, where I promote civic engagement advocacy within our community as Asian Americans, specifically in the Vietnamese community. And I am also a new hire as a hotline advocate at Michigan's Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And then something I've been involved in for a while, I've been a volunteer at MSU Center for Survivors, which is a sexual assault program at MSU, where I volunteered for the crisis chat and the hotline, and now our new healthcare program, and I'm a medical advocate there, where I help support survivors through their SANE exams. So yeah, super honored and excited to be here today.
Awesome. Wonderful introductions. We have some powerful people here. So let's start off the conversation about why is it important that people of color pursue careers and work in healing professions? And again, anybody can open in this conversation first. So go ahead.
I think it's really important because just sitting across from a client who looks like me, or at least has some cultural experiences that resemble mine, is very powerful. There's this idea of not having to retell our stories over and over again, whether that's in a clinical experience, so a therapy, session, whether it's in a medical profession. It's an imperative. It's really an imperative that we are getting into these fields, because our people are ultimately the ones that are being impacted by not having access to services. And there's so much stigma attached to mental health. There's the stigma, there's the generational trauma. So even going into, your primary care's office, that's the first place generally you even say, oh, I think that there's something going on with me, and to not be able to have someone sitting across from you that can even have a slight appreciation for some of the nuances of your life really makes a difference. And I think we just have to do a better job ultimately of supporting our folks, really. And I say our folks with an X, but our folks with being able to get into these fields so that we can, in essence, say, hey, we are here. We're here. We're here to support. And, at the end of the day, we all go through it, and having that too, being able to say, I've been through it too. And sometimes that makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I could say much better than what you said, Nedra. I think that's so accurate. I think, especially coming from like the male perspective, being a Black man and being in this profession, like I understand that I'm a bit of a unicorn, that there are not many people who look like me who do this kind of work. And I think to then, know that there are all of these disparities within, the BIPOC population, and that there is access to care concerns and ability to reach out and receive these services, or there's that stigma, to be a part of like being able to break that down for people and say, like, it is okay as a Black male to talk about your feelings. It does not make you weak. It's, about, fixing a lot of that socialization and, all of those things historically that have happened, for generations of people. It's the beginning of fixing that and healing that. And I think that if I can be just a small part of the solution, that feels like, worth every, moment of stress and frustration that jobs like this can cause. That makes a world of difference for an individual. And to have, I think, like you said, Nedra, to have somebody sitting across the room from you who looks the same, sometimes that's just enough to provide a sense of relief. Like, I know I've talked to a lot of family members and, that are Black men who are now open to the idea of going and getting mental health treatment or going to see a counselor. And that's like really, really amazing, because like growing up, you know, that was something that was, you know, frowned upon. I think mental health in general is like, you know, people only go when they have like severe mental illness or there's something wrong with you. And sometimes it's just about shifting the idea of what mental health is and what it can be for people. And I think there's just a lot of work to do with that, with people of color, especially. And I think that has to start with, you know, us being part of those conversations like we're doing now, which is great.
I really resonate with what both of you guys have said. I think that in terms of being a Vietnamese American or even a broader spectrum, being an Asian American, there's not a lot of Asian mental providers in general. At least in my experience, me going to my own personal like mental health care, looking for a provider, I personally found it hard to connect with anyone else because I couldn't see someone who looked like me. So that which inspired me to go into this field and to kind of be that role model and be that provider that I want growing up. And so in terms of like just a stigma around mental health, I think there are lots of, at least in the Asian community or within my household, lots of talk on like not talking about your emotions, kind of like holding it in and kind of like letting it go or moving on, when really I think with mental health and with trauma specifically, you have to talk about it and you have to be able to process those things with someone else and to be able to heal and grow from it. I think it's super important. And maybe some people feel like they could heal from just holding it in gradually. Within time, they could overcome it. But I think in terms of complex traumas or just how complex it can become, those conversations can be really hard if you're handling it by yourself. And so, yeah, that's all I had to say about that.
And I want to add to kind of to piggyback off what you both said is that relationship to, right, like not only what we were raised in, our family of origins and the stigma attached, right, and the importance of us going into these fields, but also, you know, being raised in churches, right? So in the stigma attached to, you know, again, you don't, you know, you pray to God and that's it, right? So the idea of mental health, the idea of therapy was and is still somewhat something that is taboo. Now we're starting to have more conversations about it and it's great. But again, the importance of us going into this field and even more people going into this field who may be, you know, of the faith or, you know, or spiritually based is so important because I'm finding a lot more people who are wanting Christian therapists and wanting, you know, to have that part explored more. So I think, again, it's just an imperative at this point.
Yes, and a few of you actually answered the next question that I was going to ask, but if anybody wants to elaborate on it, let me know. It's basically just how does culture influence a person's ability to seek mental health services? Does anyone have anything to add to it? If not, I will move on to the next question. Go ahead.
Well, since you put it out there, you know, I mean, it is so intertwined, right? I mean, it's in our, I can't say enough how much is in our bones. And we really are at a point where we have to almost unlearn a lot of what we've been conditioned to think. And from a patriarchal standpoint, right? I mean, so there's, you know, the patriarchy's culture, and then it's our culture, and then it's, you know what I mean, all these different things. So being able to look at, you know, how our culture influences, right, like our help-seeking behavior is important because, you know, when you think about even just within the LGBTQ community, you know, I have family members who identify within that community, and I am a huge advocate for those communities. But again, that paired with religion, paired with mental health, they typically don't mesh well together, right? And so when you talk about, you know, suicide rates, when you talk about rates of depression, anxiety, you know, trauma, you know, all of those things, they are all impacted because when you talk from a cultural perspective, we have this idea that we don't talk about it, you're going to hell, You know, this is sinful, you know, it's not okay for girls to kiss girls. I mean, so there's all of this, you know, shame is embedded in our DNA, you know, and it's been there for generations. And so when we look at how do we move past it, this is how we move past it, right? We talk about the uncomfortable. We have these conversations that are uncomfortable, and we have them sometimes sitting across our faith-based communities as well.
I think while Nidra was sharing, I was thinking about the intersectionalities of all those different social identities and how that makes everything so complex. And I think we mentioned earlier about generational trauma, and I think it's important when thinking about culture, how every single cultural group has different generational traumas, whether you're Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, like it's so different. And there's a lot of crisscross and lots of similarities, but it's also super important to realize how diverse it is and how the way you approach in terms of therapy or in terms of care can be very different, similar to what Nidra said.
Thank you for sharing, both of you. And how do you feel like, what can we do to challenge these misconceptions that people really, including myself, grew up with? I grew up in an apostolic church, Black church, and therapy was God. And you know, over time, I've unlearned some of those things, but it took some time. But how do you, as mental health professionals, try to take away those misconceptions?
Yeah, I think a lot of it starts with having conversations like this. You know, to have a group of 4 people of color having an open conversation about how these kind of things can be problematic and how they can impact somebody's mental health or their perception of mental health or their desire to seek out mental health, and how that, I think like the shame piece is a really big part. Like you had mentioned, Netra, like we see that all the time with, you know, especially when we're dealing with kids that have experienced trauma that we do at Small Talk, that, you know, shame is kind of like built into it. It's part of recovering from trauma. There are very few kids that I think we see that don't experience that at some point in time. So when you add that, the cultural piece in with the trauma, I think it's so difficult to unwrap. So I think some of it is on us, especially, you know, if we're talking about kids in particular, as adults, to start having those conversations with, you know, with our children. Like I have a 3-year-old daughter. You know, we'll openly talk about, or she's 4 now. Sorry, Zalani. She's so we'll talk about, you know, we'll talk about mental health openly, you know, at home too. Like she knows what I do. You know, I don't want it to be a secret. I think mental health has always kind of been this thing that it's like we don't talk about it with people. And like I have my brother-in-law, like we'll have like hour-long conversations about mental health stuff, and he's another Black man, and it's like wonderful. And it's like I haven't been able, especially in my adult life, to have those kind of like open conversations with somebody. And I think, like, you know, as a mental health professional, it can be our responsibility to just be kind of very outward with the work that we do and let people know, like, it's not the scary thing, or it's this thing that you go to because you have a mental breakdown. You can go because you have a really bad day. And it's not, you know, it doesn't have to be this scary, stigmatized part of your life. It can just be normal. I like the way that I think about it a lot is like, it's like going to the gym. We encourage, you know, when somebody says like, I go to the gym, you know, 3-4 times a week, we're like, great, wow, I wish I could go to the gym 3-4 times a week. We need to have that kind of same perception about mental health. Like, oh, I go see a therapist every week. And you're like, wow, that's great. You're working out your brain, you're working out all this stuff. You know, and I think that's so important for us to do with, you know, families of color and people of color, because they're just so behind the 8 ball because of history and that historical trauma, like that you had mentioned, Sue. That it's just like there's so much catch up work to do. You know, but I think having conversations like this is a great place for us to start.
And I think too, like some of the ways that I try and approach it is, you know, I think one way that we've really done a disservice in some ways is we separate everything out, right? Like we separate, physical health, we separate, emotional, right? Wellness, mental health. We do a lot of separation. So sometimes when I do like mental health first aid trainings, I take it a step further, or even when I'm meeting with clients individually, I take it a step further and I say, hey, this is your whole health, right? So just as much as you go to the doctor, right, to, like, let's say you have an infection, right? You have a doctor on standby. So you already have an established relationship with your doctor, so when things are going well, when things aren't going well, you already have that established relationship. Same philosophy with the therapist. Things can be going well, it's kind of like a booster shot, or, sometimes things aren't going so well, but overall, this is about your overall wellness, right? Because everything is connected, the brain, the body, we're all, it's all one system. So when we separate them out sometimes too, right? So we're saying almost the physical health part, like even when we're talking about, illness, right? Or, well, the physical illness part, it's the physical symptoms, right, is what we see. We tend to pay more attention to that, but we don't always pay as much attention to the stuff that we don't see, when in actuality, hey, we need to pay attention to the whole thing, right? And so being able to really give someone a different way of looking at it, even, I think is can make the difference depending on who your audience is as well.
I think something else important to consider on top of like normalizing these conversations and also giving a wider picture of a wider scope of how we deliver services. I think what's important too is in terms of research, I feel like for people of color, I think research is so far behind in terms of the type of treatment methods we use, the type of like services we use. It's very far behind. I remember when I was at Small Talk, I was researching on the diversity of like how CPT or TFCPT is applied to people of color, specifically for Hispanic, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Americans. And I found that lots of the research I found were saying like, these are the common patterns, but again, like there's barely any research. So I think it's also important for us as providers to advocate for more research for people of color too, so that we're actually giving the adequate and more qualified services for our folks.
All very wonderful answers. And the next question that I have is, what interested you in this work initially?
I can go. Mine's easy. I just always wanted to work with kids. So, I had thought about being a teacher for a while. Dealing with more than one kid is a lot for me. So I think therapy is really, really good because it's just one-on-one. It's very manageable. But, I think whatever I kind of wanted to do for high school and college was, just be helpful. I always found the idea of, mental health and, just the idea that your brain can do all these like really, really amazing things, just through talking about it is just like really, really fascinating to me. So I think like in high school that I got put in an AP psych class I didn't want to be in. I kept trying to get out of it, and the computers were broken, and then the counselor wasn't there. So it was like, I just like, whatever, I'll stay. And I just fell in love with it. And, I felt like this is what I was here to do. It was here to find a way to help people. I think, especially like in the last, like, I don't know, 6 months or so, I've really kind of had this like personal awakening that like, there's a lot of power in me being a Black man and doing this work. Like embrace, I know I mentioned like that I felt like a unicorn in a lot of ways. Like now I feel like I fully embrace that. I think it is something that is like such a gift to be able to give to somebody else. To be able to, like Nedra said, have that person across from you that looks the same, maybe share some of those same experiences, can relate on a level that's, very different from maybe what some other providers can offer. I think, again, ultimately it was just, I want to help people. And I think it's really, really important work. So.
I think I relate a lot in terms of like wanting, like with you, Alex, in terms of like wanting to help and like having this urgency to help. And I guess growing up, I grew up in more of a like complex home. And I think that as I got older, I felt like I was always interested in mental health, always interested in telling my mom, I can tell how I feel. I can tell you that I'm sad and mad and it's okay. And so I think growing up, I wanted to be the person to be able to advocate and support kids and even adults to be able to express what they're feeling, to be able to work through these complex emotions, because I think it's kind of that saying where to build a child, it takes a village, or something along those lines. I'm probably saying it very wrong, but it takes a whole community to help support someone. And I think that in terms of my assets of being someone who is who's open-minded, who wants to be encouraging of others and advocate for others, I think that that's important to add to that community to help support others in terms of going through therapy, going through mental health, just because it's so complex. And I think that's a common pattern that we've all been saying, but yeah.
You know, I think for me, I always wanted to either be a teacher, or I think we all kind of trend down the same, or, again, in that helping profession. And it really hit for me in middle school, just when it came time to, those relationships, right? Being a girl in middle school, oh my goodness, all the drama, okay, of, oh boy, you like my guy, or I don't like myself today. All of these things that we go through in our minds, and so for me, it just felt like I don't know who to talk to, really. The only people we have to talk to were the guidance counselors, but they were to help you set your schedule, right? There wasn't a lot of talk when I came up. I'm probably the oldest amongst you all. But when I went to school, it was to help you set your schedule. There wasn't so much talk about therapy, counselor. It was even more taboo. And so I just knew that there was something missing, and I felt like there was this disconnect. Then, fast forward to college, I'm like, oh, social work, that's right up my alley. Then Columbine happened, and it's like, this is why I need to do what I need to do. And so for me, it just became really a call to action, and it's been a call of action ever since, and even more so serving people, for my people, by my people, in essence, has been even more powerful for me.
Since we're on the topic of discussing career, I think we should also have a discussion about higher education institutions and what role do you think they play in making sure that they have a diverse enrollment of students who are entering or interested in mental health care professions? And Sue, I want to really actually have you answer this question first, since you're the most recent graduate.
Okay, so in terms of what role the educational institutions play, I think it's important for them to actually market towards POC. And I think lots of the events that we have on, especially for MSU's campus, is usually geared towards white folks. All the advertisements, if you look online, if you look at all the providers at MSU CAPS, which is a great organization, but in terms of the services they provide, it seems very geared towards white folks. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in terms of having that wider scope and diversifying our services, I think it really needs to be geared more towards people of color. And I think even outside of the talk of relating mental health and persons of color, I believe as a student, most of our services for mental health, I think we're allowed only 3 visits to count to MSU's CAPS, only 3 free visits. And in terms of, I think we all know here that in terms of care and giving services, 3 visits isn't enough to process anything really per se. And I think that it's a disservice to all the students, because transitioning to college, even if you're not going into the helping profession in terms of all students, that isn't enough. It isn't enough for the student body. It isn't enough to help all the students transition into their careers and to be well-minded, to be healthy in terms of mental health. And I think to even have these discussions, most of all of our events geared towards mental health too, you only see social science majors rather than seeing the STEM majors, rather than seeing engineering, mathematics, and all those people that I think are not really exposed to these conversations. I think it's important to diversify who we're talking about mental health too, because it's not just those who are providing the services, but also everyone should be involved in these conversations.
My experience having worked on campus and having worked with another university is that there is not a lot of marketing that goes in towards recruiting students of color. And I say that from the standpoint of I still end up having maybe one or two, if that, students of color that are in my cohorts. And that's not a lot. And that's if I'm lucky. And so, you know, what I would say is that there is still a gap, you know, and it's a concern because part of the problem, I think, again, we're talking about a top-down approach, right? Is we need to do better from hiring top down. You know, we're still not at the table, you know. You know, there were tables that I attempted to be at, but sometimes people don't want me to be at their tables, you know. I'm okay with it, but, you know, at the same time, I think that there is still this, there is fear around having, you know, us at the tables, because if we're at the tables, then that means that you may have to be held accountable and you may actually have to do what you said you're going to do, which is diversify your staff and really recruit people that are going to be reflective of the staff or in the students that you want to bring in. And those are the tables that we're still not a part of. So until those tables change, the trickle down approach is going to just be, well, you know, we're welcoming for all, but not for a few.
I couldn't agree more. I think the marketing piece is huge. I mean, I think when going to, you know, being an undergrad and then going to grad school, especially after leaving grad school, my initial thought was, you know, I'll go work in a, you know, at a CMH or in a therapy office. I'll see 6 clients a day. I'll go home, I'll eat dinner, I'll go to sleep, I'll wake up, I'll do it again. Like that I don't think that there was portrayed to me the diversity of what you can do within a helping profession either. That it doesn't just have to be you can still be a helper and not have to sit in front of somebody for an hour and talk about their feelings. There's so many, especially when you look at something like social work, where the diversity of what you can do with that degree is so expansive. Or, you know, for me personally, coming to Small Talk, you know, knowing that, you know, I have access to all of these other systems and get to see how they work and be involved in the court process and the legal piece of it, and, you know, get to see all these other ends of it, and then be the mental health piece of this larger, you know, village of people, like Sue was saying, that are helping these children heal. Like, that is such a cool experience. And that's something I had no idea even existed coming out of grad school. So I think, like, in that environment, like, letting people know that it is more than just, like, you know, helping. Like, there's so much you can do as a helping professional, that it doesn't have to be this very cookie cutter, like, you know, I think a lot of people go into it and they have this image of Freud where you know, he's sitting in the chair and the person's laying on the couch, and, you know, you're doing word association, and, like, that's not what therapy is at all right now. It's very dynamic. I mean, it's as dynamic as you make it as a professional. There is so much that you can do and insert into it. I mean, like, Dedra, you had mentioned, like, you know, it involving, like, yoga and other things like that. There's so much that you can do, and you can make it whatever you want it to be, and it's going to be helpful for somebody. And I just think that was not the perception that I had going into grad school, or even, like, graduating from school. It was kind of like I had to kind of find that on my own. So I hope, you know, people of color who are thinking about, you know, going into this industry, when they're watching this, that they take that into account. Like, it can be so much more, and you can make it into something that's, you know, like, I mean, Nedra, you're creating something that did not exist before. Like, how cool is that? I mean, that's what we all hope to do. That's how we make change.
And I want to add just a little bit to the discussion. I remember going into a university, and initially I wanted to enroll in the social work program, and I went to the information session, and the professor or the dean at the time said, if you can't make this your full-time job, then you're not going to be successful in this program and you should not consider it. And I was a non-traditional student and I felt completely just, I fell apart basically. And I cried in my car because I felt defeated. And then I actually went into the political science program, which I'm really happy that I did. And I graduated with my poli-sci degree. But I just reflect back on that experience and how I know I was not the only person who felt completely unacknowledged. And I actually had this conversation. I spoke on a panel with the university a few months ago and talked about my experience and how accessibility is so important in higher education systems, and honestly meeting people where they are, in practice is something that is so important. If you're trying to diversify your student body, you need to be able to understand the external circumstances of your students, because we are people. I tell professors, and I've had conversations with administrators about treating people not like they're robots, but treating us like we are human beings who have different identities and who have different familial responsibilities as well. So I believe that, there's there's conversations happening, but I do believe that accessibility is also a very important factor in making sure that you have a diversified student body. So I also want to go to the next question, which is, what do you wish you had known before you started to do healing work?
I think the importance of doing your own healing work as well. You know what I mean? I learned it later in life, just life. But the importance of whether it's, tending to your own self-care, right? Or whether it's, if you're in therapy, probably not a bad idea for you to be in therapy. If you're a therapist, making sure that you are taking care of your own trauma, taking care of your own things, and because again, you learn about it in school, right? Like, countertransference and all of the things, but in real life, right? That's a whole nother story, right? When you're sitting across from someone and, they're reminding you of, right, like that experience that you had, that unresolved thing that you didn't deal with. So the thing that I wish I had known beforehand was just the importance, the true legit importance of doing your own work, and now I would say continue to do your own work.
I think I was having a hard time thinking because I was like, I don't know the answer. This is a really hard question. It's a good question, Egypt. And I think like Nedra, you're 100% right. I think I would agree with you completely. I think it's like doing a lot of your own self-work, because I think like there's this concept that I love that one of my friends would tell me is like, you can't give, you can only give from your overflow, right? So if you're at 100%, you can give somebody else, a portion of that. But if you're operating at like, 60, 70%, you don't have a lot to give. So I think you really have to kind of take stock of that and understand that. And I think too, especially in these helping professions, I think Egypt, what you said really resonates with me too, because it's the idea that like, in these helping professions, it's like, we have to be like on call 24/7 for our clients. We have to be everything for them at all times, and push our own selves down in lifting other people up. But if we don't have that capacity to do that for ourselves, we're not doing anybody any good. So I think, having that understanding, like, I wish that dean would have told you, Egypt, is that like, yes, like you got to take care of yourself. And that is like so critical, because when you leave your office every day, you're carrying like the emotional weight of 6, 7, 8 people during a day with you, and you got to take that home, and you got to be a parent, a husband, a wife, a mother, you have all these other roles. You are still a person. So it's really about like, how do you balance, this really important work with also taking care of yourself? And I think the more that people in the helping professions can understand that and embrace that and not have to have that mentality of being everything for everybody all the time, I think makes such a huge difference. And, keeping people from being burned out and keeping people, good people working in this career for a long time. Because we see that so often that people get, just burnt out from the amount of work that they have to do and the emotional weight of it all.
I think for me, I'm not fully in the field yet since I'm still a student, but coming from a student's perspective, I think lots of my courses, like one of the first chapters we go over is self-care. And I think as I get older and as I kind of pick up more things on my plate and kind of feel like I'm becoming burnt out, I start noticing that self-care is really important. I think both these two have emphasized that. And I think it's important to understand the effects of possible secondary traumatic stress as a provider. And I think it's important to understand that, to be mindful of your own reactions to your clients too. Just because it could also impact how you deliver those services as well. If you're not able to regulate yourself, be able to kind of ground yourself in that moment or even afterwards or beforehand, then that means the services you provide to your clients could be not as the quality as we'd want it to be. And it could also turn into that, I believe in class we call it like the role confusion, where the client becomes a therapist themselves, and like no one ever wants to find themselves in that situation. So it's really important to take the time to just take a deep breath or just go outside. And I think that's something that I'm still learning. And I think in my self-care class, we always say that self-care is a journey. So just because you take a course, just because you went on a run one time doesn't mean you're done. It's an ongoing thing. It's a continuous thing as a helping professional.
Thank you. And you actually, Sue, kind of went into the next question. So working in this field and as a person of color, I'm an organizer. So I've done a lot of organizing work and a lot of trauma. And oftentimes we center ourselves in this work. It's not like a job where it's just 9 to 5 and you leave and that's it. You're working at a bank or something. It's like you can kind of shut off. But when you're working in a field that can take an emotional and mental toll on you, it's a little bit different. So how do you honestly practice self-care? And sometimes when we hear that word, you've been hearing it a lot lately. I feel like sometimes it's one of those buzzwords, but honestly, working in this field, we all kind of you kind of all hinted to the fact that, it's important that you prioritize your own health. How do you do that working in a field that you're constantly working in trauma work? So how do you protect your own self?
I mean, I think for me, it's, trying to leave it at the door. I think the easiest solution, and this is one I wouldn't recommend for somebody if they're really struggling with self-care, but is becoming a parent. Like, you shouldn't become a parent just to have some self-care. But I feel like that was like a huge kind of mind frame shift for me when I became a parent, because it's like, oh, I have to be present for this person when I go home. It's not like I can't carry that stuff with me and interact with her and be, the best father that I can be if I am not fully present and here with her in this moment. And I think just her example has kind of inspired me to just kind of take that, a bit further every time. So it is really about that car ride home or that car ride to go pick her up is really just I just dump it at the door. And it's a lot easier said than done. And I think it takes some time. And there are some days certainly that I don't do a good job of that. But I think kind of being very conscious of that and having that mentality and knowing that I got to go home to her and my wife and be present for them and take care of the things I need to take care of at home and, be the good father and husband that I want to be, is just what I think gets me through it, and helps me to compartmentalize the the professional side of me with the personal side.
I think for me, and Alex, wait until they turn 16 and 25. Okay.
Yeah, no, I don't want to talk about that yet.
Okay.
So we'll just keep going.
Okay. But, I think for me, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but, therapy for the therapist. So, therapy is very important for me. And so just making sure that I have someone outside of my own life that I can process stuff with, as well as my faith, my spirituality, my relationship with God is very important to me. And music, music. So I look at it from a stance of music therapy, if you will. I've always enjoyed dance and singing and all of that. So I can legit, like, actually, my kids and their friends left me by myself on 4th of July. And so I had my own little dance party and then I posted it. But let me tell you, I have fun just by myself. And a lot of the things that I talk to my clients about are the same things that I do practice. So aromatherapy, I have, the salt lamps all around. I've got air diffusers, essential oils, when I'm feeling dysregulated, again, the breathing techniques, all of those things I do legitimately practice. Sleep and a little binge watching. I mean, it's amazing how much I can get through and still be an effective therapist. But on the flip of it, though, I think a lot of us probably have struggled over this COVID period, right? Because some of the ways that we probably have practiced self-care, or another way to look at it is care of self, has shifted because that time period from leaving, whether it was work or school or what have you, to coming home, right, was part of our way to, like, leave one place and coming home to the, we don't have that right now, especially if we're primarily working from home. So it's, being creative in how we're doing it, right? So for me, it's like shutting my office door, at my home office and leaving everything in here, right, when I'm done. And so doing those mental kind of checks so that I'm actually, releasing whatever the thing is. And Beyonce and Kirk Franklin and a Lil Baby.
I think for me, I really love music too. I think I have a playlist that I think it's called the playlist is called a playlist that reminds me that I'm a 90s kid, and it's just filled with old songs that make me want to sing and dance and laugh, and even if it's by myself. I think other things I've been trying to incorporate is, so I'm a huge planner. I have lots of different calendars. So I'm trying to start incorporating like a time frame specifically in my to-do list or in my calendars where I would say, take time for yourself, whether that is go for a run, going to embroider, going to spend time with some friends and family. So I think for me, I have to create like a physical toolkit. So I have lists of things I can do. I have like things I can like check in on, whether it's like reminding myself on my phone. I have reminders that tell myself like, oh, check in with yourself, take a deep breath or something like that, because I tend to forget those things. I tend to say to myself, oh, if I just keep getting through the day, I'll just sleep and then I'll just wake up, it'll be fine. But I think it's important for me and like probably for other people too, to kind of stop and to take a minute. Because if you're just on the go, there's never a point where you're able to actually reset. You're able to actually let go of those things, drop all of those things at the door, like Alex said, or even just taking a break for yourself. And yeah, so that's kind of what I do for self-care. And I think that self-care is like very diverse and can be different for everyone. So you can be really creative with it. And I think it's important for our listeners to know that like self-care isn't just like a cookie cutter. It's like what works for you is what's best for you.
That is so true. I know we have 10 minutes left, but I'm hoping we can squeeze 2 more questions. Because Nidra, you actually brought up another question that I wanted to ask, which is COVID-19. And I kind of commented on it earlier, but I would love for all of you to elaborate a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected mental health. What have we learned from it?
I mean, I think for us, like at least in the work that I'm doing, like I'm seeing a pretty significant increase in the like levels of, self-harm and suicidal ideation, or at least that it's coming out more. And I mean, obviously that's really concerning and I guess not too unsurprising considering the last 18 months that all of us have experienced has not been, I think, enjoyable or good for anybody's mental health. I think, Nedra, you spoke about, just the idea of alone time is great, but 18 months of alone time is a lot. So like the isolation that I think everybody has experienced, and maybe not having access to a therapist or a trusted, other person in your life that you can kind of, get to, shed some of that like mental, debris with, that's a lot harder to do. And doing, we've been doing therapy online at Small Talk for the duration of the pandemic, and it's challenging. I mean, we're very lucky in that we have some kids who are, absolutely thriving, and it's going really, really well. But some kids are definitely going to be, better served in person. But we have to then, weigh somebody's physical safety with, their mental health. And that's just a really hard thing to, reconcile and compartmentalize. Because I think, like you had mentioned, Nedra, too, like it's all intertwined with each other, right? So, I mean, there's like, we can't really make that kind of distinction. Like it's all one person and it's all important. So I think it's definitely been a huge, huge challenge. But I think as time is going on, I think we're finding ways to adapt and, organize our services and our, the way that we're providing treatment to best fit the needs of people in, a virtual environment. I think we have to, because it's becoming more important than ever. And I think, I'm hopeful that going through this process will inspire people. Like I've seen more about, telling people to access mental health because it is so accessible now because of the virtual aspect. So I'm hoping that, even if it's people who aren't, going to the traditional route of coming into an office and receiving services, if it's somebody who's like, I can't do that, but I can do it over my phone while I'm sitting on my couch, great. If that's what's going to be best for you, then you should do it.
To answer that in some ways, yes, since COVID, I would say my practice grew like 1,000%. I don't even know if that's really a right number to say, but I mean, in terms of the number of people of color that we're serving grew. In particular, our African-American men grew, and who were wanting to come in and do the virtual, because we did transition to all virtual. So I would say that there was an uptick in that, and an uptick in seeing a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma. We had a lot of more trauma, sexual trauma, people wanting to navigate and process that. And then too, a lot of therapists that were, wanting to process too, like new therapists to the field, process what this experience has been like even for them, right? I mean, just graduating, just coming, having this experience, and now what in the world, right? I'm now having to adapt to potentially doing work virtually, or not even being able to start a job right away. And so it's impacted so many different areas and so many levels. And what I'll say from a mental health standpoint, from, a whole health standpoint, is that everything has increased, right? I mean, or it's been more visible, if you will. I mean, it's not as though it's been hidden per se. Well, yeah, it's been hidden in a way, right? I mean, we haven't talked about it. Now, you're seeing more people of color talking about it. Mary J. Blige has a documentary out there now, and she's talking about her mental health. Taraji Henson, has a foundation. I mean, so there's a lot more celebrities even talking about it. And I'm finding a lot of teens are feeling more comfortable talking about their own mental health challenges. And during this COVID, I'm finding too that people don't necessarily want to return to face-to-face, because there still is a lot of fear around people's irresponsibilities and safety. From a therapy standpoint, there still is this fear, and working with and processing the fear around, how do I return back to this work environment when my employers aren't keeping me safe? And then I'm going to be the angry Black person talking or raising my hand saying, well, no, I don't feel comfortable going back to work, but then my job will be threatened. So, I mean, there's a lot of heightened still emotions around all of this.
I think definitely going off of what Alex and Nedra shared, I think there's a lot of like positives, but a lot of negatives in terms of COVID-19. I think there is a lot more initiation talking about certain topics that we've never talked about, such as like there's a lot more, at least on Instagram and TikTok, there's a lot more awareness of different disorders or different rates and different services there are out there. But also there's a lot of anxieties, lots of uncertainty. I would say there's a lot of like question marks and lots of like, how do I even transition back? How do I even interact with everyone else? How do I, and I think there's a lot of fear too of like when you're isolated, I think lots of those like mental health battles kind of come up, just because I think maybe all of us are, or maybe many individuals are used to being on the go and kind of like bearing all those mental health issues that we all battle with. So having those come up when you're by yourself and then all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, okay, all the COVID regulations are lifting up and everything's going back to normal. How do you process those things? How do you transition back? And I think lots of people may be struggling with that. So I think overall there's a higher need for mental health services, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person. I just think there's just more of a need for more people to join the field and to be able to help support all these individuals and to support ourselves as well.
Thank you. And I want to wrap up with this last question, and that's what new ideas or policies are you excited about in relation to mental health?
I'm excited about, hopefully teletherapy continuing to be a thing, and it being more accessible. I'm excited about telemed period, right? Because again, people don't always have access. And so being able to know that people can be able to receive services without leaving their home would drastically improve people's like, hey, I think I might try this. The smartphone, the apps are making it so much easier. I use a lot of apps in therapy. So, there's a lot of apps that are useful for therapy. I mean, there's Shine, Liberate, both are people of color owned apps that are related to mindfulness and meditation. But, being able to get these and, these kind of apps out there and sharing them with people that we're working with, right? I mean, they have these tools right available to them. There's also like VR, the VR is like becoming a big thing in mental health now. So, like for exposure therapy, right? And then there's also like some stuff related to, what is it? A video game, like prescription video games for folks, for kids between 8 to 14 for ADHD. So there's a lot of amazing things that are coming down the pipe. With regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, my hope is that we'll continue to, right, like be more of a presence in every institution, not just a footnote, but we will have more of a presence. So that's my hope. But yeah.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, Nedra. I think the idea that, there's more accessibility to mental health because of, virtual therapy or teletherapy, I think is huge. And I think just, I'm feeling like there is some sort of like culture shift when we've obviously, not only we lived through this pandemic, but we've lived through like this, really significant racial reckoning, within the past 18 months as well. And I think it's really unfortunate that obviously, these horrible things have to happen for us to kind of call attention to, disparities and things that are wrong with systems that are, serving people of color. But I think that, what we can do with the best way to honor, the victims of those crimes is to then use that memory for something positive to impact the next generation of people of color, to close those gaps and really create not equality, but create equity for everybody. I think it's like, and I feel like there is and it may be, the social circles that I'm in are maybe a little bit different than you know, how everything else is happening. But I think like the kind of conversations that I feel like I'm having with people that don't feel like these weird conversations that never come up, they feel natural, they feel normal, that there is a more openness among all people to be able to have these kind of conversations and really see what changes we can make on like a macro level for people of color, I think is really, really exciting. And, you know, that's what I was kind of hoping we would be able to do, you know, be a small part of that with this panel today. But I think that, you know, us just being able to continue to have these conversations and, you know, have the technology to, and we're all in different places right now, to be able to have this conversation and that we can create space for these conversations to live, you know, online forever. I think is a really, really, it's a great gift, a great blessing that we have the opportunity to have this platform and that we have a voice, because, you know, hundreds of years ago, a conversation like this never could have happened.
Okay, so that concludes the discussion. And I just want to close with saying that, you know, just to piggyback off what you were saying, Alex, too, is visibility. There has been an increased visibility about the conversation of mental health awareness. Even movements like Black Lives Matter have created more conversations about the importance of access to mental health services. So it's something, it's very definitely something that it has become more apparent in discussions. You know, from when I was growing up, it was something that really wasn't discussed that much. So I really do have hope for this new generation where they're just way more cognizant of their own mental health and the mental health of others. So I'm really happy and excited about this new generation. But that concludes the panel. I want to thank you, Alex. Me and Alex, actually, I didn't even get an opportunity to say this in the beginning, but me and Alex both serve on the governor's task force for child abuse and neglect, and Alex is also chair of our protocol subcommittee, where I'm also a participant in. So thank you, Alex, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this discussion. It's definitely something that was needed, and I really hope that people who are watching this, for those who do have an interest in getting into the mental health field, that this definitely provides you with some insight, because I really do believe transparent conversations are really important, especially to those really who are kind of on the fence and don't really have enough information. And a lot of the questions that I believe that we were able to ask and you all able to answer are not always accessible to people. It's something that's not really mainstream. So I encourage you, Alex, to continue to have more of these discussions, because it's definitely needed. So thank you all. And I didn't know whether or not anybody had any last comments, anything that you want to say before we end the discussion. Go ahead if you do.
I just want to say thank you to, you know, you, Sue, Nedra, and Egypt. When we first were conceptualizing this, you know, all three of you kind of came up for different reasons. And I think that, you know, this was the right group of people to have this conversation. So just want to thank you for taking the time to do this for us at Small Talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And hopefully we'll all be able to connect again. Seems like we have a talk show.
Right.
Absolutely.
Be well.